One of the questions we get from people after they buy their first electric violin is, how do I make this thing sound more rock? It doesn't sound very rock, and that's why I bought the thing. It sounds kind of still classical. What button do I push on my pedal board to make it happen? It's not about pushing buttons on the pedal board. It's the way you play the instrument. If you want to sound more like Jimi Hendrix than Hilary Hahn, we got some tips for you. And hey, no shade toward Hilary Hahn, she's amazing, but if you're wanting to sound more like Slash, we got to play the thing a little different. One of the most common mistakes people make is that they'll buy a distortion pedal, slap it into the signal chain, and expect it to have some magical properties where it's going to transform your sound from this clean, really well-behaved thing to something kind of angry and sloppy and rock and roll. Rock and roll is not a genre, it's an attitude. It's like the difference between singing ta-ta-ta and da-da-da. It's just a little more stank on the second one. You gotta be mad. We had gotten this comment on a video where somebody was asking about how do I make my violin sound more rock, and kind of half jokingly, I replied, well, you gotta get mad about something. Again, there's no button, no knob, no pedal that's going to make this thing sound like that. It's got to come from here and from here. I like to say that styles are like accents when we're talking. You got to have the right accent to go with the right style of music. If you're playing bluegrass music with a classical accent, it's just going to sound like a classical player trying to play bluegrass. It's like if you say, y'all come back now here. It doesn't work with a Boston accent. It only works with a Southern accent. It's the same with rock and roll. You've got to have the attitude when you're playing rock. If you're playing it with a classical accent, it's just going to sound wrong. There's a bit of a devil-may-care kind of attitude that has to come with rock and roll. It's an abandon. There's sort of a looseness or a I don't give a crapness to it. And it's not that we're playing sloppy or loose or out of tune. There's just a little bit of sort of that mindset to it. Rachel Barton Pine is probably the best example I can think of this. She's an amazing, amazing classical player, but she's a metalhead deep at heart, and you can hear this certain amount of freeness or wildness or abandon in her playing, even her classical playing, that's like you don't hear from other classical players. Rachel has been kind enough to put a video together where she talks about the difference between rock vibrato and classical vibrato. And if you use rock vibrato in Beethoven, you're going to get kicked out of the building. If you use classical vibrato in rock, you're just going to get laughed at. So let's hear what Rachel has to say.
So a vibrato, of course, is an oscillation where you keep your finger on the string and either rock your hand or rock your arm if you're doing arm vibrato, or do that, whatever, however you describe it, with cello vibrato. But rock vibrato is actually not the same thing at all. So you're not taking the note and just increasing the oscillation, because all it does is just make a juicier, normal classical vibrato. What you're actually doing is, it could be considered closer to like a slide. Where you're basically holding the hand still. You can actually let the thumb be a little bit off the fingerboard, very loose. And then you're going up and down like a glissando for maybe a quarter tone or a half step above and below the pitch, which is getting that sound. So let's see, say we're doing C sharp. So normal vibrato would be that, where you're going, and your finger is rocking. But for rock vibrato, you're actually doing around the C sharp. So practice it by going, maybe kind of from an out of tune D to an out of tune C natural around that C sharp, and then just gradually get it faster and faster. Again, for all string instruments with your thumb either very, very loose or even off the fingerboard. For cellists, of course, this is a couple of inches, whereas for violinists, it's only a couple of centimeters. And the wider you get, the wilder it sounds. Now, of course, you could combine this with ponticello to get a distortion sound, or you can combine it with a little bit of a harmonic-y sound to get feedback. That's other stuff for another day.
One of the other big differences between classical music and rock music is the groove. It's the feel, it's our relationship with time and where we are versus the beat. Rock and roll is a very rhythmic genre. Where we play in time is extremely important. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to play a little lick and I'll put a beat on that. We'll play ahead of the beat, on the beat, and behind the beat, and you can hear how different these things sound. If you're playing with a drummer, you have to be very, very conscious of where exactly you are placing your notes versus the beat. When people think about rock and roll, they think about guitar. That's the primary instrument in most rock songs. We've got to think about the way guitar players articulate their notes if we want to sound like that. They've got a pick, which allows them to really hit notes and give them a sharp transient at the beginning. They also have the ability to play more legato. So we've got to kind of think about these articulations the way a guitar player would. The other thing to think about is intonation. Yes, there is a center frequency for every note, but we often try to work around that and use intonation as an expressive tool. Think again about guitar players and the way they bend their notes, and they will intentionally be a little bit out of tune to use that as a way to express themselves. This is especially important on your odd-numbered scale degrees, so 1, 3, 5, and 7. The flat 3, the flat 5, the flat 7 are super, super important notes in blues and rock. Remember, the flat 3 is minor, the natural 3 is major. So if we're kind of back and forth between that flat 3 and the natural 3, kind of an ambiguous 3-ish type sound, that gives us the ability to control the emotion of that sound. Where the minor sound is kind of sad, the major sound is kind of happy. We can be more ambiguous with that if we're really kind of touching up that intonation in there. Another really important element in rock playing is the use of harmonics. People will often ask if we can play pinched harmonics the way guitar players do. The mechanics of how a guitar player plays a pinched harmonic kind of takes that off the table for us. We can't lay our hand on the string while we're picking it or bowing it like they do. But we can use more natural harmonics than they do because we can force that string to vibrate with the bow, and we can kind of manipulate what we're doing with the pressure on our left hand and still force that string to vibrate. That gives us options that they don't have. Now we've got a video from my friend Brandon Hoff that's going to explain the use of harmonics with violin a little bit more. Let's check that out.
I use natural harmonics. So these are rich overtones that you can achieve by placing your finger at select points on the instrument lightly. Most violinists will be familiar with the halfway point harmonic. But I also take use of the harmonic series on the violin, and you can achieve harmonics at the second finger, third finger, and fourth finger. And then I also am able to achieve the sound with my first finger using the techniques that we will later to discuss. So these are the second, third, and fourth finger harmonics. The next thing that you're going to need is vibrato, but you cannot use a classical vibrato. Classical vibrato would be fast, narrow, and bending below the pitch. So you can't use a classical vibrato with this. you're going to use a more modern rock style, which is going to be a wider and slower vibrato, which is going to go above the pitch, mimicking a guitar bend. Violinists, we use more slides. We don't really bend the strings just because there's so much tension. So I'm going to show you how I would do that. All right, so I'm going to be on a harmonic. And then there, using the technique, I was able to get the sound on the first finger. All right. The third component is called sul ponticello. And this is a term that means on the bridge. So to achieve it, you're going to have to play close to the bridge. And this is going to create a metallic and harsh sounding of the overtones that are comprised of a harmonic. But it's going to add a bite. It's not necessarily needed to get the sound, but it's going to give you that bite. So I'll show you. There's it on a solid note, and then here's with the techniques applied that we talked about, the harmonic and the vibrato. The last component that I'm going to discuss is an effect, and this is distortion, kind of the quintessential guitar effect that you think of when you think of that rock sound. This is going to further emphasize the overtones that I was talking about earlier with the harmonics. The reason that I wanted to discuss this last is I don't want you to use it as a crutch, because the sound primarily does come from the techniques that I discussed earlier, and a lot of people will use effects to compensate for their tone, but tone is really in the fingers. So here's how the techniques that we discussed earlier sound with distortion. So.
So at the end of the day, the instrument is not what makes you sound more rock. You can sound just as rock on your acoustic violin as you can on an electric violin. Now, you can't add effects to your acoustic quite as easy. It's hard to get a delay sound unless you just play the note twice. And Rachel Barton Pine teaches a class on that too, actually. But yeah, it's not the instrument, it's not the pedal, it's not the knob, it's not the button, it's you. You can do this, you can play more rock, and then when you add the effects to your rock playing, it's going to become all that more authentic. So yeah, rock on.